The new house was supposed to be a sanctuary, a safe place. We'd been working non-stop for about 9 months. At that point, we were both ready for the move and needed a break. The prospects of a new house and being settled once and for all were overwhelming for both of us. We looked forward to this move, and nothing was going to come in between us and that house. We packed up the little studio and cleaned it thoroughly, but when we went to get our deposit, the landlord was nowhere to be found. We headed off to the new house anyway, as if we were letting go of the past. And somehow, even though we got stiffed, everything was okay. Again, nothing was going to come between us and our house. By the end of the first day, we had all of our belongings into our new home. And as we made the bed, suddenly, from the kitchen, there was a very large crash. We both looked at each other and then walked into the kitchen to find one of our brand new dishes had fallen on the floor and shattered. Confused, my wife said, "I never took any of those plates out." She walked over to the counter, and there was the box and the other 5 dishes, still wrapped in paper. It was then that we heard behind us the sound of paper moving across the floor. I reached for the light switch, and as it came on, my wife and I stood there and watched the wrapping paper that the plate was in moving from the living room into the kitchen where we stood on its own. It seemed to hover across the floor. We stood there staring at it. I looked up at my wife. She looked at me. We were both amazed. Still, we were tired. I picked up the paper, crumpled it up into a tight ball, considered that the paper was caught in a slow draft from the air conditioner, and threw it in the garbage. It landed right on top, and I'm sure of that. The second occurrence happened after we'd been in the house for about a week. I was working on my computer, and it was approximately 10 a.m. We had set the studio up, and so the drums, guitars, amps, soundboard, PA, speakers, all of the equipment was right where it needed to be, and just so for the band on Friday night. My wife was at work, and the house was dead silent. As I typed, I could hear the keys clicking under my fingers, when suddenly, in the studio, 35 to 40 feet from where I sat at my desk, all hell broke loose. It sounded as if the entire drum set was knocked over, and the PA speakers were knocked from their stands. As I jumped from my desk to run to my closet to get my weapon, I heard the drums being destroyed, cymbals crashing. The PA speakers fell to the ground with such force I felt it in my feet in the closet. I never in a million years thought I would be faced with a situation where I would have to cause harm to a violent human being who was attempting to rob my home. Or worse. I slipped from the bedroom, through the dining room, and put my back against the kitchen wall. I paused for a second and listened. I heard nothing. I approached the studio door, reached out, and grabbed the handle. I steeled myself and prepared for the battle that was about to take place. When I opened the door, it was pitch black inside the studio. Quickly, I reached around the corner and flicked the light switch on to find everything in its proper place. I was completely shocked. I didn't buy it. I ran into the studio and pointed the gun behind the door, but no one was there. I looked around, and everything was exactly the way I'd left it not more than 20 minutes before. What just happened? I was looking out my kitchen window and up the hill. The hill went up to about a 400-foot peak. The ridge was approximately 1,000 yards long and extended in my view out my kitchen window. It was late fall and the tree cover was sparse, so I could see almost all the way up to the ridge and all the way down the full 1,000 yards. I was washing vegetables for soup, and I happened to look out the window and saw something moving through the tree line down the ridge. At first, it just seemed like a shadow or maybe a bear. It was low to the ground, but it was large when compared to the trees at the top of the ridge. And then, to my amazement, it stood up like a man. This was not a bear. It was not a man either, but it was like a man. Then, horrifyingly, it disappeared on the trail that leads to my house. Though I wasn't sure what was going on or what I saw entirely, it was disconcerting that it seemed to be headed towards me. A barrage of things was going through my head. If this was real, it's coming here, was one thing. I quickly turned the faucet off, dried my hands, and looked at the kitchen door. Right then, I heard movement outside the kitchen window. I backed up against the refrigerator and looked at the door again. The handle started to turn. I stood there in astonishment, thinking, there's a monster outside my house trying to come in. I didn't know what to do. I moved towards the door and grabbed the handle. It was then to my right, at the kitchen window, that I saw a shadow move past. I quickly locked the kitchen door and moved back away from it. It was at that point that I saw the creature. It looked like a primitive man. It did not have a coned head, as I've heard described in many eyewitness accounts from a Sasquatch sighting. I don't even think this was a Sasquatch. It appeared to be, by all rights, a caveman. We looked at each other for about 3 seconds. Me pinned against the refrigerator in shock, and he with a deadpan confident look on his face. It was as if he knew I was somehow altogether insignificant. And that's how I felt. The whole thing lasted about 3 seconds. He turned from the window and walked towards the left. I pushed myself off the refrigerator and approached the kitchen window, and as I did, I saw him disappear into the ground brush of the trail leading back up to the ridge. I don't know if what I saw was a Bigfoot. What it looked like to me was a very primitive man. One thing's for sure, nothing and no one has ever stood at my kitchen window before. It's 8 feet off the ground. September 14th, 2013, Martin County, Florida. My encounter with Sasquatch was not what I thought it would be. It has changed my life forever. It forced me to question everything I thought about the wilderness, science, our planet, our history, all because of this one 3-second encounter. The trip had been postponed 3 times at that point. Matthew had called me on 2 of those occasions and canceled, and the last time I canceled. We were supposed to go fishing, and I was going to show him a few things that I knew about tracking a Sasquatch. In hindsight, I realized that if I had brushed my teeth for 2 or 3 more seconds, I would have never saw what I saw that day. And maybe none of you would know who I am. He showed up at about 4:30 a.m. that morning in Boca Raton to pick me up, and we drove about 45 miles to Martin County, Florida, out by Pratt and Whitney, to an area called Hungryland. I had never heard of the place, and so I didn't know what to expect, but I figured we could find some animal tracks. Anyway, I think Matthew and I arrived there at about 6:45 in the morning, and the sun was just coming up, and so we got out of the truck and made a few casts and watched the sun come up, and the place was quiet. You know, it was very quiet. That's one thing I remember is how silent the area was where we were fishing. There were no sounds from birds, save the occasional frog jumping in the water, or a small panfish hitting a minnow. There was no sound at all in the ambient tree lines or anything. So the plan was that we would fish until the sun came up, and then I would survey, where we were at and try to determine where, we could find some animal tracks. I'd never been to this place. Like I said, I had no idea what to expect, but I figured we could find raccoon tracks or deer tracks, and I could actually show him how to track one of these creatures. The fishing was actually terrible, so once the sun came up, I was anxious to move on, and so we continued down the canal, and we found this land bridge that actually crossed over, and there was a levee on the other side of it you could drive on. So we drove across it, and we continued heading north on the levee into the interior of this area. We were approximately 2 miles from the main highway and the entrance of this area at this point, and we fished our way north along that canal, moving the truck as we retired that portion of the bank by casting, and we weren't getting any bites. So the fishing was terrible, and so as soon as it got light, I started to survey the areas off of the levee to the west of us, and I was looking at one particular patch of saw palmettos, and I happened to notice how large they were at the height from the distance we were, which was about 150 yards across about 2 feet of water and mud and swamp and cattails. You could tell they were about 15 feet high, but one portion of it looked disturbed, and I kept looking at it. Well, I walked back about 50 yards and I looked at the area again, and there was a huge doorway into this saw palmetto patch. I stood there for a minute and considered what I was looking at, and if it was just something natural, and was I really seeing what appeared to be a doorway, and it just was there, and so I said, "Matt, come here, man." And he walked over where I was, and we both surveyed it, put our fishing poles down, and decided to go over there and see what it was all about. The walk off of the levee, that 125 to 150 yards, was through knee-deep muck that was trying to suck your boots off with every step. And so I almost turned around 3 or 4 times, but I'm really glad I didn't, because with what happened after this, I realized in hindsight that if we hadn't done everything the way we did, I would have never looked up at the right moment to see what I saw. As we neared the patch of saw palmettos, we started to come up, and the water shallowed, and it turned out hard ground. It was an island, and the saw palmettos were 13 to 15 feet tall in their highest spot, but a consistent 12 feet. And from the road and up on the levee, you could see that this wall, this huge saw palmetto head, um, was hundreds of yards wide and 1,000 yards long. It was tremendous, you know. As we got up on that hard ground, I took a couple steps to my left because the doorway in this thing was sort of angled, catty corner in the shape of the bush, so you couldn't see it straight on from the road unless you were really looking. And I was surveying the area. It just happened to catch my attention. But so anyway, I moved towards it. It was indeed manufactured. There were palmetto fronds, branches broken off that created this archway. There were branches that were broken off that were bent up in and over top of other branches that were missing palm fronds on the ends. And it was not just a few, it was an entire tunnel that was 8 to 10 feet high and 50 to 60 inches wide. And it went in as a means of getting through this saw palmetto head that, and you know, the area stunk too. And right off the bat, you know, I got that sensation that, you know, we were somewhere we weren't supposed to be. And it was within seconds that the gunfire, you know, went off and started going off approximately 300 to 400 yards from us. And we heard buckshot hitting the palmettos around the head, that saw palmetto head that we were standing in. And I said, we need to go now before we get shot. And so we immediately left there. Now, I was standing 7 to 10 feet inside that doorway, looking at a full-on tunnel that went around a corner to the left, and I couldn't see in there. I couldn't see around the corner. I would say that I felt an extreme sense of dread in that place when I was standing there. And that's when the buckshot came. So we left, we immediately went back into the water in the knee-deep muck and made our way all the way back to the levee and got in the truck. Now, Matthew is looking at me and he's like, man, you know, these guys are, you know, they're going to hurt somebody. And we're looking out at this swamp buggy. And there's 3 to 5 individuals on this buggy, and they are firing rifles and shotguns. And I think one guy appeared to have a handgun. While they're just flooring this thing, it sounds like a dragster. And so I'm like, let's get out of here, man. You know what I mean? So this is like a dangerous situation, it appeared to be, you know, and it seemed very irresponsible. So I was like, let's get out of here. So we drove down the levee, and I was like, looking at what we just did and trying to come to grips with what I just saw, which was obviously made by somebody. I mean, every sign of break in there requires hands to do that, and the way it was manipulated and wound up and tangled up intentionally to make it so that it was out of the way in the ceiling through the whole place, it was frightening, to be honest with you, because somebody would have to take so much time to do that you would think they're living there, and that's what I was thinking, and I felt like I was trespassing when I was going in it. So we drove down the levee, I'll bet probably a mile, and on the left-hand side, I caught a glimpse of a sign, and I was like, oh, look, and it looked like there was another levee heading due west, and there was a sign, and I was like, pull in. So we pulled in to the left, and the sign read, Old Indian Town Trail, Lake to Beach Trail. And we looked at it, and we were like, whoa, you know, there's a trail, let's check it out. And so we got out of the truck, and you could hear the swamp buggy flooring it way off in the distance, like coming towards us. But we got all of our stuff together, and we went down onto the trail, right at the trailhead, and stopped. You know, so at this point, we had we had left our fishing poles in the truck, and Matthew had a backpack, and he may have even had a camera in his hand. I don't believe the camera was ever on or turned on until after the incident, because the incident happened almost immediately when we got on the trail. We started to walk, and we walked about 50 yards, and he had been fidgeting with his knapsack, getting it on correctly, and he was having some difficulty with a waist strap that came around his waist from the bottom of the knapsack. And I was like watching him mess with it, and I was walking, and I looked up down the trail, and it appeared that the trail went ahead for another 100 yards and then banked to the right. And right then I started hearing the swamp buggy even louder, as if these guys are now arriving in the area we're in right now. It's like we can't go anywhere, is what I thought. You know, these people are in here firing guns. And what if they're doing it again? And the swamp buggy was coming, and he was looking down at his waist, and I looked over, and he had a long strap hanging, and I reached for it, and it was the tensioner for the waist, and he just clicked it, and it was locked finally, and I wanted to snatch on it and say, let's go. And I snatched on it, and the guns started firing again on the swamp buggies, which was, it was so loud, like it was like maybe 500 to 1,000 yards from us, somewhere in there. There were trees on the sides of the trail that were 8 to 10, in some cases 15 feet high, so we couldn't see over them to see the swamp buggy that was out in that wet prairie. And it was coming, and then I'm pulling on the strap, and here goes the guns being fired. And I heard 3 distinctly different firearms go off. I heard a shotgun, I heard a rifle, and I heard a handgun, and it sounded like a revolver, a very large caliber revolver. And I looked up towards the sound, and out of the bushes, 70 yards in front of me, a giant Sasquatch flew through the top of the bushes on the left side of the trail and did a hurdle over those bushes and was coming down and covered the 20 foot of the trail and landed in front of me effortlessly. And I was looking at it, and it was flying through the air, and I was thinking, what am I seeing? I couldn't even believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a movie, because it was a huge guy with gray, white, light gray skin, and he had gray hair that was silver shiny, and it appeared to be moving on its own, but it was the wind when he was jumping, and it just had this effect to it that it looked like it was shimmering almost, to where when he was jumping and the hair was wisping in the breeze, it seemed like he had this aura around him that was like somehow reacting in the sunlight. I don't know how to describe it, but I know I have in my research since. I just didn't know what to think, and I thought I'm like, this thing, I expected it to wreck. There was no way this thing was going to land, and it landed effortlessly. And I saw the mid-tarsal break and how that worked to allow this creature to land from a 20-plus foot jump. The mechanics of the feat is what I saw, and it was effortless for a creature that had to be minimum 550. I'm saying 550 to 650 pounds. He landed, and I was looking at this whole thing, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I could not believe what I was seeing, because it was like, well, there it is. It's like, there it is. There's a Bigfoot, He had shoulder pads of hair, like big tufts of hair coming off of his shoulder muscles, which were significantly larger than any shoulder muscles I've ever seen on a man. And his biceps were the same, and they had a huge blue vein on both sides of his biceps. Had a huge blue vein running down the front on like the front outside edge of each one of them. Uh, he had a 28 pack, and you could see every single muscle group beneath this thin hair that was essentially hanging off of the body because of the muscle structure. The hair hung off the muscle groups above and wasn't touching the body, but it was thin enough where you could see it all because the body appeared to be. He looked dehydrated, like you could see. He looked like he belonged in a weightlifting show, like Mr. Olympus. You know what I mean? You could see every muscle group, and so I was looking at this, and I mean, I was like admiring this thing, and I mean, it was something to see, man. You could see this thing perfectly, and I must have made a noise. That's all I can think, because suddenly he became aware of us, and he rotated his upper body. And it was weird because then the palm fronds that he had contacted when he landed came loose, and they went in between him and me. And so now the palm fronds were in front, and all I could see was his lower body. And it was kind of humorous because it was him. You know what I mean? But he was hiding behind the palm frond, and he reached up, and I saw the motion of his arm behind the palm frond, and this huge white, grayish, light-skinned hand. It was like a super light gray. It pulled down the palm frond, and he leaned over, and his whole upper body went on an angle. And he didn't have a pointy head. He had a giant human skull, and you could see that the hair was like exactly the shape of the head. And when he leaned out, and the palm frond got caught on something on his hair, and the hair parted, and he was staring right at me, and I could see his whole face, and his face, he appeared to be an albino. It was so light, the skin, if it was gray, it was light gray. But you could literally see purples and pinks and flashes of chrome where the sun was catching it, and all of this color movement on his face. And I couldn't understand what was going on. And then I don't know if the sun went behind a cloud or what happened, but the light level changed, and so did his coloration. And when that happened, he was staring right at me, and his pursed lips, where he was squinting, turned into a scowl. He scowled at me. It's the one part of the encounter that sticks with me the most, and I have it. It's etched in my mind. The look he gave me. I looked over at Matt and said, "Turn the camera on, turn the camera on." And when I looked back, he was gone, and the bushes were moving where he stood. We walked down that area and ended up finding two 18-inch tracks. The second one was in an ant pile, and the ants were just coming out. He had just stepped there, not a few seconds before we approached. So we knew he was right there with us. If it wasn't for this first incredible encounter, I probably would have never started the Bigfoot Researcher's Journal. But what happened to me that day changed everything. And I'm pretty sure if you saw it, it'd change everything for you.